My name is Andrew Perlott. Welcome to Socratic State of Mind. Alaric called, "Your statistics are lying. Intangibles don't appear in white papers." 408 AD. Alaric leads his Gothic horde into Italy, ravaging all the way. 2008 AD. An invisible tangle of bad incentives and government policy wreaks economic havoc in the United States. What do these have in common? Statistics suggesting they won't amount to much. I was thinking about this circa 2008 because an editor assigned me background research on the economic chaos unfolding around us. I pored over several years of Federal Reserve minutes and statements from the Treasury Secretaries. Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Henry Paulson had trotted out statistics by the dozen to prove that the crisis would be minor if it happened at all. The American economy had, quote, strong fundamentals, unquote, and would shrug off a downturn like a head cold. But the waves of layoffs and cratering stock market suggested the experts missed something. I kept returning to how convincing the stats sounded and how irrelevant they turned out to be. If they weren't relevant, what was? In my free time, I was reading Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he set up a marvelous comparison that helped me make sense of it. Gibbon gives us stats, if you will, for Roman-controlled Italy in 218 BC, right before Hannibal Barca led his army over the Alps, set on humbling the growing republic. Then he gives us stats for 600 years later in 408, right before Alaric and his Goths invaded. Any way Gibbon slices it, the later Romans seemed better prepared than their forebears. Larger population, bigger economy, more wealth, better state capacity and tax-raising ability, an expansive and wealthy noble class who might pitch in, better technology, weapons factories capable of equipping entire armies, and the list goes on. Yet when Hannibal trapped and slaughtered 70,000 Roman soldiers at Cannae and 20% of the male population of Rome vanished that day, the survivors kept raising armies as fast as Hannibal could mow them down. They outlasted him. They wore away at his finite supply of soldiers and punished those who dared to side with him. The Romans would not surrender, no matter how badly Hannibal mauled them, no matter if the war took their last denarius. Their descendants, better equipped in every essential, weren't able to raise a single army as Alaric fell on them. They found no worthy commanders to lead their scattered garrisons. No one wanted to stick their neck out. The bureaucracy united only to bring down the half-barbarian general who'd proven Alaric's only able competitor. When the Goths came for Rome, the Eternal City surrendered almost without a fight. A faction even threw the gates open for the invaders. And what of Italy in 2025, we might ask? Would it provide the strongest opposition of all to a new invader? After all, it's richer, more populous, and has high-tech armed forces to protect it. All the stats suggest it would put up the strongest fight, but I think Gibbon would call bullshit on our confidence. A survey found that only 16% of Italian adults would fight for their country if it were attacked. It must have been the same in the 5th century. Why risk yourself when you can pay barbarian mercenaries to defend you? Does it even matter if a Roman or barbarian emperor is in charge? Gibbon's point is that there are often no stats for the unquantifiable essential, in this case in "I'll give my life and fortune for it" commitment. Are you an integral part or only along for the ride as long as it doesn't get too bumpy? Without knowing, our conclusions are built on confidence-sounding guesswork that might lead to disaster. If you transported one of those hoary survivors of Hannibal's victories who kept signing up for more campaigns into the 5th or 25th century Italy, they would spot the problem immediately. Something was missing from the people, but social cohesion, patriotism and societal buy-in are only vaguely measurable, so we're presented with what's easily quantified, as if it's the worthiest measure. We get proxies of dubious significance and are led astray. Let's look at it another way. Today, we assume meritocracy is always good and nepotism is always bad, but how much of that is based on having limited data? During the Napoleonic Wars, the British sank French ships at a rate of 7-1 on average, and 32-1 for battleships. The explanation we get is that the British captains were selected on merit, while the French ones were nepo babies, essentially. That's only half true. Yes, would-be British officers had to survive 6 hard years of training aboard ship before passing taxing exams at the Admiralty. That's the merit part, the measurable part, to weed out the obvious slackers and incompetents. But how do you choose captains from among these competent officers? The Admiralty's method looked a lot like nepotism. The man who sank the most Frenchmen in this era was Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. He'd served under an earlier era of officers prizing order following from top to bottom above all else. That played out disastrously, since in an era before radios it was often impossible to receive and implement orders in the smoke and chaos of battle. Nelson was the product of a move away from this. The admirals of his era wanted captain-level decision-making and tactical aggression. They felt you couldn't go wrong if you went for the enemy's throat, and that aggressive captains would best cautious ones. How do you find these bold officers, though? Because exams weed out incompetence, sure, but can't detect unfakeable aggression and fighting spirit. The solution was having successful officers recognize what statistics couldn't uncover. To do this, they were necessarily promoting from those they had close ties with. It takes one to know one, in other words. Talent can spot talent even if the stats are silent on the matter. This sounds like a recipe for choosing incompetent relatives, but the results suggest differently. In a study of the Royal Navy between 1690 and 1849, drawing on performance records from 5,800 naval officers, those with family ties promoted to captain outperformed unconnected ones on the most important metric: sunk ships. Better assignments, crews, or equipment were ruled out as factors, and there was heterogeneity among the admirals making selections. The captains with personal connections to admirals were 23 percentage points more likely to capture or sink an enemy than unconnected officers in chance encounters on the high seas. They were also less likely to fight in indecisive battle. The authors note, quote, essentially, connected officers either lost or won and never experienced a draw, whereas nearly a fourth of all unconnected officers fought indecisive engagements, unquote. How many outcomes in life hinge on these factors that can't be quantified, or at least are very hard to quantify, and which we're likely to be completely ignorant of? There were unknown stats behind the 2008 recession, too. Regulators and officials knew there was a parallel shadow banking system rivaling the public one in size, but since they didn't have a way to measure it, they paid it no attention. That made their declarations of solid fundamentals worthless. I think we can draw some conclusions from this. First, many talking heads will turn out to be wrong, but we won't know which ones in advance. We don't have the time to gain sufficient experience to judge for ourselves in most areas. It's best to minimize contact with talking head ideas to prevent a false sense that you know what's going on. News intake can be minimized as we restrict our reading to fundamental principles. Second, we're unlikely to find infallible truth, but we can get incrementally closer to mastery and expertise in a few chosen areas. I provide a link here for more info. And then third, data is great. It's a useful guide for decisions, so give it its due. But we're ever blinded by the stats we have, which glare so brightly that we can't say what we don't see. And finally, when data backs a particular ideology or dogma or identity, it ends up making us stupider by rendering the beliefs itself painful to critically examine. You may find these conclusions disappointing. Maybe you want me to say, just call on it takes one to know one level of expert and you'll be fine. But unless we're that guy, we can't spot them from among the crowd of gossip mongers and keyboard warriors. So basically, what I'm saying is be humble and be skeptical. That's a decision that rarely lets us down. Thanks for listening. See you next time.